I suppose everybody knows what's going on in Palestine. So whenever I come across a slide that explains the situation, I'll just skip it, okay? But if you don't know something or don't understand, please ask and interrupt me, okay? It shouldn't be a lecture, you know? And we can talk during the lecture. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about is based mainly on my book, Palestinian Israeli School Books, Ideology and Propaganda in Education, that was published in 2012. And in this book I studied Israeli textbooks until 2009, okay? Poverina. I studied books of history, civic studies, and geography. Now, in Israel, school books are private industry, and everyone can write a book, but they all have to be authorized by the Ministry of Education. That is why they have to comply with some principles of Zionist ideology, such as Jewish historical right on the land, and the land means the whole land, not the state of Israel. In geography book, for example, nobody speaks about the state of Israel, but about the land of Israel, which we are told is one physical entity, and it is the promised land, the biblical promised land, and you will see later. Some other principles are the fact that most non-Jews are anti-Semitic, that the Arabs abandoned the land, and that they have 22 other countries to go to. They don't have to be with us. That Palestinians are a constant threat, and therefore they have to be controlled all the time. And that the highest principle of Israel is to have a Jewish majority in order to preserve the Jewish state. This is the most important thing, okay? How do you do that? The books differ, whether they are more left, more right, but the principle is there. And if the books are not doing that, they are not authorized. I mean, these are not written principles, but if you look at all the books that were not authorized, you can see what happened, okay? They say they are not Zionist enough, and this and that, okay? Now, teachers can choose. There are hundreds of books, and they can choose what they want, but all of them should have the stamp, okay? And, okay. Every time the government changes from central to more left to more right wing, they shred a book. They literally shred it to pieces, okay? And today there is a huge war in Israel around civic studies books that was changed. And so we see school books are very important. They are a battlefield. For the simple reason that most children don't read anything else. These are the books they read because they have to have them for the exam. So whatever they know from these books and nothing else. And this is why it's such a terrible battlefield between political governments, between political parties. If you look at the books, you wouldn't see the difference so much. But, for example, one book that was banned, it was banned because they used the term ethnic cleansing. And it was banned in June. It came back in September. And instead of ethnic cleansing, they put organized expulsion. And that was good. That was okay. Okay? So you cannot see the big difference, but the words really matter. Books, now I'll say something else, that these books I studied both by Jewish and Palestinian Israeli students. They are translated to Arabic, the same books. are translated to Arabic. Not the Palestinians in the territories, but the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. They study the same books as the Jews, which means they study the narrative of Zionism and of the state of Israel, Holocaust, and everything you want, and they don't study their own history. They don't study their own literature. They don't study their own culture. Okay. Now let's see. Now, the question I asked myself was a variation of a question Frantz Fanon asked in his study of racism. He asked, how do the oppressors behave? Okay? And I asked, how do the oppressors educate their children? How come nice Jewish boys and girls become monsters once they put on a uniform at the age of 18? How do you do that? Because it's not easy. You know, education, apart from that, is very liberal and humanistic in Israel. How come they become such horrible monsters? What is the part of textbooks in that? It's not only textbooks, of course, but textbooks have a part. Now, a little bit about the background of this study. First of all, what is called social semiotics. Semiotics is the science of signs, and that means that when I see a page, I look at everything on the page, not only the words. Okay? I look at the organization, at the framing, at the pictures, at the colors, at the layout, and the relationship between chunks of words and pictures and so on and so forth. You look at everything on the page, and everything has a social meaning. Everything conveys the meaning. Most studies of textbooks do only what is called content analysis. And that is why last year or 2 years ago, there was a big study of Israeli and Palestinian school books that said, well, things are not that bad. Huh? I don't know if you saw it. Daniel Bartal and Sami Adwan, they got $500,000 each from the American Congress, and everything is fine. But what they did, they said, you see, Israelis do mention the Nakba. Right? Things like that. And I say, yes, they mention the Nakba, but what do they say about it? What do they say with it? Okay, so it's also a study of rhetoric. And we shall see later that they say a lot of things. So that and critical discourse analysis, which is about the same, but just for words. Verbal and visual representation of others. Yeah, there's a lot of work about representation of others or racist discourse, visual and verbal. Geography studies and sociology studies of racism and history studies and so on and so forth. Okay? So everything goes in it. In such a study, you have to use everything. Okay, so this is what I told you about social semiotics, that no sign is neutral. We treat every sign we make, whether it's a word or a figure or a gesture or voice or color, as motivated by interests and perspectives of values and positions of the sign maker towards their audience, their recipients, okay? And all signs reflect ideology and affected by use, by the history in a given culture, okay? Every sign we make is given its meaning within a certain culture and society. For example, today I was on a tour in Prague, and I was very surprised that they didn't say that Kafka was Jewish. You see, in Israel, this is the most important thing you say about someone, whether they are Jewish or not. And I thought, why don't they say he's Jewish? Maybe here it would be a sign of racism to say that he was Jewish. Okay, the guide said that he was Czech, and that's it. All right, you see what I mean? So I know that in France it's considered racism to say the Jewish scientist. But in Israel, even if he has one gram of Jewish blood in him, they would say the Jewish scientist, okay? And it's not racism. So the signs get their meaning in the culture where they are produced. Okay. And the questions about signs is, how they change reality into a version of this reality. Yesterday we saw documentaries, and in every documentary, the reality is changed into a version of this reality, right? And then people want to kill each other about the truth. Everyone has their own version of the reality, okay? Children know it very well. I think one of the first things that they learn when they come into the society of children in kindergarten is, I'll tell on you, right? I'll tell the teacher, so she'll get my version. They understand the power of story. Everyone has their story, and children know that if I go with my story first, the authorities will believe me and not you. So we know all these things. But what happens in school books is that people treat them as if nobody wrote them. Nobody knows who wrote textbooks, right? You don't remember the authors of your textbooks. It's just the facts. What do we care? But textbooks are written by people with ideology. And even if they have the appearance of objective, neutral, factual reports, of course they are not. First of all, the choice of the fact, then the organization of the facts, and then, as I said, the organization on the page. So all these things are motivated by ideology and interests, and we have to read the text and try to extract from the text the ideology that made it as it is. School books are not meant, contrary to what people think, they are not meant to give an accurate story of the past. They are not meant to give an accurate picture of the present. They are meant to use what is called usable past, to create such a past for the children that would be efficient for the future and explicable for the present. Now, in history school books, it's very important because every nation has what it's called its founding crimes. How do we explain massacres? Okay, we have to explain them in such a way that it will be used for a good future. Children can live with it. Children can legitimate them. So the accurate facts are not the most important thing for any school book in the world, right? Wirch, for example, who said that, studied Russian school books, of course, you know. Now, Israeli school books are meant to inculcate the Zionist collective memory to both Jewish and Arab students and to reproduce a Jewish national and territorial identity. This is very important because for the Israelis, the territory is part of the identity. In Israel, there's never been a peace education, never been peace education programs. This is not interest of the state to have a peace education. And really, they don't want to teach it. They don't want to teach anything about the neighbors. They don't want to teach anything about the Middle East, and they don't. Israeli people and children, they don't know anything about their neighbors, nothing, except that they are terrible problems and threat. Okay? So the dominant narrative, like in any ethnocracy, and we can call Israel ethnocracy because there's one ethnicity that dominates other ethnicities, and I don't mean all the Jews dominate the Arabs, but among the Jews you have a certain group that dominates also Jewish ethnicities because racism doesn't stop at the checkpoint. It goes into the society. And they reinforce the narrative of this dominant group, which is the founders, the East European Jews and so on, Zionists, while silencing, degrading, and ridiculing contrasting narratives. Okay? The other narrative is not acceptable, no matter what it is, and we saw it yesterday in the film about Muhammad Bakri. If Muhammad Bakri goes to Jenin after a massacre and shows you the results of the massacre and interviews people who suffered from the massacre, the Israelis said, there was no massacre. You are not allowed to say anything about what happened there because you are the dominated and not the dominating group. Okay, that was the whole thing. And of course, we know that nationalism breeds racism. We don't have to go over this. And what happens in Israel is what is called the racialization of Palestinians. It's if they are a race. And it's a new kind of racism that's called neo-racism or cultural racism or differential racism. The thing is, you are different from me. I don't want you to mix with me. I don't want you to be a part of me, and that's why I do whatever I do to you. Yes? Don't marry me, don't live with me, don't study with me, don't have your children play with my children. And it's not because you are black, and it's not because you have a big nose, it's because you are different. It doesn't matter what. So this is the kind of racism that is dominant in Israel. And this racism goes all over the place. And so how do you explain this to children? How do you justify it in school books? The fact that there are citizens and second-class citizens and third-class citizens and fourth-class citizens, because this is what you have in Israel. You tell them this. There is no contradiction. This is from a civic studies book. There is no contradiction between the fact that Israel is comprised of a civil nation of citizens and the fact that several ethno-cultural minorities live in it, but the only nation that enjoys self-determination is the Jewish one. So this way of presenting things doesn't give you any space to argue, okay? Because the book says there is no contradiction, and then it gives you the contradiction, but this is a given, you cannot argue, okay? I'm telling you there is no contradiction, and that's it. Okay, now this is 2013. This is after my book was published. Now, Palestinians, as you know, live in what is called state of exception, which means they live outside the law by the law. Okay, Palestinians cannot go to any court in the world, not only in Israel, to plead their case, right? Nobody will defend them ever, ever. They live by military rule, which means, what you know, okay? Again, you create some dogmas. This is the way it is, all right? This is the way it is. For example, here, this is another civic studies book of 2013. The Arab population is defined as native minority. They have been transformed into a minority following their painful defeat in the War of Independence, and that explains their difficulty in accepting their minority status. Also, Zionist ideals and Israel's definition as the state of the Jewish people makes it hard for them, for Israel's Arabs, to accept their minority status. This is it. Okay? This is it. That's how you explain it. Well, it's hard for them, but that's life. All right? Now, Palestinians in Israel are called Israel's Arabs. They are not called Palestinian. Palestinian always go with terror, but the people themselves are called either the non-Jewish population, the non-Jewish sectors, or Israel's Arabs. Okay? Everything they are not, the non-Jewish, and so on. And this is, of course, on purpose, because one of the principles, as I told you, is that they have 22 countries they can go to. They are one of the part of the Arab nation, and so on and so forth. What I said before, of course, Palestinians in the territories, they live under military rule, and that's why we see children thrown to jail, interrogated, tortured, whatever. And you know it happens every day now. This girl was 45 days in prison. She's 14, and now we have a new achievement, this one. She is in jail. I don't know if you saw the pictures in how they caught her on the way to school. You see here. Wait, I'll just do it a bigger. Okay. Yes, they just caught her, and they told her that she had a knife, she had scissors, she had a stone. It doesn't matter. Okay? If you are under military rule, nobody has to explain anything to anybody. Okay? And of course, her parents haven't seen her, and so on and so forth. So this is this girl. She's the youngest prisoner in the world. She's 12, you see, they just got her and threw her on the ground, handcuffed her, and took her to prison. Why? Because. And there's no way she can plead in a court. This state of exception, this is what it means. Now, usually state of exception is a situation that lasts a few weeks after wars or things like that, not 50 years. Here it lasts a little bit too much. So how do the books present this kind of thing? Okay, how do they legitimate to the children? They say it's normative, as we saw before. This is it. Or the discrimination is their lot. This is the destiny. Or their fault. Or the necessity for Israeli security, which is, this is the sacred word. When you say security, nobody can say anything against you. And there are several, linguistically, it's interesting to see how it goes. One way we call naturalization, which human actions are presented as natural processes. Nobody's to blame, that's the way it is. For example, in the late 60s, an Arab village was connected to the central water system, and at the end of the 70s to the national electricity system. Why? It was connected. Who connected it? Who disconnected it? No human agency, no human code. That's the way it is. For the Arabs, the electricity is very slow. What can we do? Okay, this is naturalization. Or their lands are diminishing. They diminish. This is what they do, lands. Arab lands, that's what they do. They diminish. What can we do? Okay, you present it as a natural process. Nobody's to blame. This is the geography books. Something that we call existentialization, this is what we saw before. That's the way it is, okay? It simply exists. For example, in Arab villages, the standard of infrastructure is not satisfactory. That's the way it is, okay? Why? Who's to blame? We don't know. Just like the sun rises, this is what you have. Or in Yama, which is an Arab village, like other Arab rural settlement, there are only few services. The bus passes 3 times a day. Why? That's what buses do, okay? That's what buses do when they come to Arab villages. Metaphorically, as self-directed phenomenon that act independently of human actions. For example, infrastructures slowly improve. With the Arabs, everything is slow, so they slowly improve. Immigration has no part in the growth of the Arab population in Israel. Why? Ask immigration, okay? Don't ask me. Maybe immigration. That's the nature of immigration, okay? So linguistically, this is the way it is phrased, and it's very important, because when you phrase things like that, you don't give space for questions. You don't give space for argument. Okay? Who are you going to argue with? Who are you going to ask? There's nobody. Or blaming the victim. This is a very good, and we know, strategy. Yeah, you blame the victims. Like, girls like to be raped or things like that. Especially black girls like to be raped. We have it a lot. The Palestinians' attempt to make Israel the sole responsible for the results of the war lacks any moral basis. When you go to war, you cannot lament your defeat. Okay? Or the Arabs brought it upon themselves, for they fought the Jews to perdition. It's their fault. Okay? They are to blame. And again, these books are very recent. This is very interesting because this book says the Arab Student Association help Arab students in petty daily problems such as housing, scholarship, loans, and employment. Small problems. The point is that they never get housing, they never get loans, they never get employment, and they never get scholarships. This is the point. Because they never get housing, because all these privileges are given only to army veterans. Okay? And many Arab students, for example, girls, because they don't get housing, they don't go to university. Okay? The parents want to know that they are safe and that they live in an institution, yeah? Somewhere where they are taken care of. And since they don't get housing, they don't go to study. So it's not small problems. These are the most serious problems. Part of the Bedouins, this is naturalization. Part of the Bedouin population dwells in 45 settlements unrecognized by the authorities. Therefore, they do not receive regular services such as municipal budgets, water, electricity, health, welfare. What does it mean, unrecognized? How can you be unrecognized? But you know the story. El Arakib, the Bedouin village El Arakib, was destroyed this week for the 95th time. And their crops are being poisoned. Also the sheep. The sheep and the fields are being poisoned. All these things are the idea of Ariel Sharon. They are not recognized. How can you be not recognized? What does it mean that you are not recognized? Okay? It is not explained. It is given. And these are the pictures from unrecognized villages. Okay, this is another one. It happens every day, all the time. All the time, and that's the way it is. Why does it happen? Because they are unrecognized. It's like we have this legal term, present absentees. You know that? Yeah, it's legal. Palestinians who came back after the war could not have their houses back and lands back. And they live, I don't know, nearby their houses, what used to be the villages. They are unrecognized, and they are termed legally present absentees. I mean, they're not there, but they are there. Okay? And the assets of present absentees are, of course, state land and state houses, and they can be given to anyone. And this, if you grow up with these expressions, they seem normal. This is it. Some people are present absentees. What can we do? Therefore, everything they build is illegal. Okay? They never get permits to build anything, not on a municipal level, not on a personal level. By the way, now we have a new Minister of Interior who was a Minister of Interior in the time of Rabin and was very good for the Arab population and was thrown to jail for something or other. And now he came back, Aryeh Deri, and his project is to finish with this. I mean, to rectify the situation. And he spoke on television in a way that no one in Israel has ever spoken about Arab population. He said, this is my objective. And he's very good. They'll probably throw him to jail again. But this is very interesting, that he, a very Orthodox Jew, belonging to a right-wing party, Shas, he's the one who is going to change it. But for the time being, most of Arab houses are built on municipal land and agricultural land that belong by the Israeli law to the state. That means the confiscated land that became state land. Illegal building is also a result of wishing to evade payment of license. And this is part of racist discourse. When you use racist discourse, first of all, you take the whole group as one, and you assign them all kinds of negative qualities, right? They don't want to pay taxes, that's why. Okay, so they are parasites. Do you remember yesterday in the movie about Muhammad Bakr, someone yelled at him, you parasite, yeah? And this is it, they build illegally. And this is what the geography book tells you. Now, one of the most racist laws, you know, in Israel we have a racist law every day now, it's amazing. But for the last 3, 4, 5 years we have, I don't know, I think over 50. Every day something else, but one of the most serious one is what is called the law of citizenship. In the law of citizenship, they added something, and what they added is that if a Palestinian from East Jerusalem marries a Palestinian from another city in the territory, they cannot live together. They cannot live together. And there are many families that are broken like that, and then the children, when they have to go to school, they cannot go to school because they are not registered anywhere. The father cannot go there, the mother cannot come here. It's one of the most horrible tragedy. Not tragedy, it's abuse. How do you explain that to children? How do you explain that in the school book? So this is what they say. The law denies citizenship from Palestinians who live in Judea and Samaria or Gaza and who marry Israeli citizens. Now, it's not true because East Jerusalem, they are not citizens, they are residents. They don't have Israeli passport, but they are residents. They can vote for the municipality, that's all. And they get, or they have to get services from Israel, which they don't, of course. Some defend the law in the name of Israel's defensive democracy and Israel's right to eliminate the danger of terror attacks, which is, of course, the magic word. Okay? This is what the book says. Some commend the law for national reasons, as if it's a different thing, and the need to prevent Palestinian immigration and keep the Jewish character of the state. And I told you, Jewish majority, this is it. The Supreme Court, the book tells you, ruled that this law is unconstitutional, but rejected the petition against it because it was an emergency law. Okay? Israel doesn't have a constitution, so if you say unconstitutional, it doesn't matter. All the laws in Israel are emergency law. All of them. Even the price of falafel. Everything is emergency law, and the government can change it all the time. That's why they can make all these laws so quickly. Okay, so the book does present this problem, but they say, listen, emergency is emergency. We cannot let the terrorists live among us. And they define Israel as defensive democracy. The advantage of military government. How do you explain that? Okay, that people live under military government for years, and they are not they don't have any kind of freedom. They are not responsible. Yesterday he said, we are only, the only thing we control is the air we breathe. But this is not true also. This is not true also. So the book says, the military government helped Jewish settlement all over the country and prevented Arab seizure of vacant lands. Now, these Arabs are the citizens of the state, but they should not be allowed to have land. And that's why the military government is so good. And this is normal. I mean, and that's why I said in the framework of Israeli society and culture, you don't have to explain it. Because it's a good thing. Not to give them land, it's a good thing. Everybody knows it. You don't have to over-speak about it. All right? One of geographer professors said, Israeli curriculum planners never resign to international borders that seem to them an accidental consequence of ceasefire commands which paralyzed military momentum. I told you that in Israel you don't have one map of the Israeli state. Nobody knows where the borders are. If you go to a bank, to a tourist agency, everywhere, to hospitals, it's always the land of Israel, the biblical land. Let's see. So this is the map as children see it. All right? Here you have some conclaves, you see, which are Palestinian Authority. But the color inside and outside is the same color, which means it's the same place. And the lines that encircle these conclaves are dotted lines, which means temporary. You see? And this is the map. Now, in all these maps, you don't have any Arab city, including Nazareth or Acre. Non-existent. Okay, now, when we want to present people in a racist way, meaning to stigmatize them as others, what do? First of all, we exclude them. They are not there, as I showed you on the map. They just don't exist. This is the easiest thing. Then we depict them with all kinds of negative qualities, as you saw before, right? They don't want to pay taxes, they're illegal, and so on. You always show them as homogeneous groups. No individuals. They have no individuals there. And you emphasize negative cultural connotation and present negative racial stereotypes, okay? For example, and I just want to say that I told you there are hundreds and hundreds of books. In no book in Israel can you find one photograph of a Palestinian human being, okay? No such thing. A teacher, a doctor, whatever, nothing of that. Never, never, okay? So this is one way, not showing them where they live, Jabalia refugee camp. And this researcher, Van Leeuwen, he's Dutch, and he studied Dutch school books, the way they show the third world. He said always from high above, you see them as a phenomenon, you don't see individuals. He said it's the angle of the pilot who flies too high to be able to see the people on whom he's dropping the bombs. Now, the text says about this camp, the population in the refugee camps is growing fast and the conditions of life are very hard. The rate of unemployment is high, the houses are crowded and poor, and the standard of health services, education, and hygiene is low. Again, that's the way it is. Why? Because that's the way they are. Okay? Of course, children in Israel don't see that. Okay? This is from a month ago, during the rains. This is what happened in Gaza, and we know why. Because Israel bombed the infrastructures, the electricity, everything. There's no sewage. And these are sewage waters. I mean, they're dirty waters, and this is how children go to school. But that's the way they are. Of course, children don't know it in Israel. You never know that. Now, the best way not to show people is really in maps, because we all treat maps, or at least children, we treat maps as something very neutral, objective, true, right? And you can play with maps. All the maps lie. We know that. Yes, in Europe you have maps where Europe is in the center of the world. Okay, it's not. You can have another map where India is in the center of the world. So maps are very good. For example, here is a map of Jerusalem, government, culture, administration, and national sites. This is East Jerusalem, you see? There's nothing in it. No government, no culture, no administration, nothing. It's empty. Okay? And as Baudrillard said, we don't know the territory. We really know only the maps, right? Nobody knows the whole territory of the country. We know the maps, so the maps are very important here. All right. And all the maps lie, yes, in Israel or everywhere. But in Israel, they lie because they represent right-wing ideological perception, which refuses to see the area of West Bank and Gaza as territory under different sovereignty. So they just don't show them. This is, for example, a map of Arab population in Israel. Okay? It is called The Spread of Arab Population in Israel 2000. Now, this part is represented as a part of Israel for which we have no data. They say here, an area without data, which means without people. It's a population map, okay? Of course, every soldier in the checkpoint has all the data about these people. But it is shown as if there are no people here. No color, it's not colored, okay? And there are no Arabs. And of course, also here you don't have Nazareth, you don't have Acre, you don't have Umm-el-Fahim, you don't have anything. You have Haifa, Netanya, Tel Aviv, Ashdod, Jerusalem, and that's it. Okay? So they live among us, okay? It's another impression of the map. They live among us in our cities, but there is a solution. There is a huge area where there is nobody. Another way to legitimate the occupation, this is for 5th grade. This is called One Sea with Many Names. It's from a book about the Mediterranean. But instead of having the names of the Mediterranean, you have biblical phrases that promise the land, of the promised land, okay? And this marriage between science and the Bible is very interesting because this way, the Bible gives a sacred stamp to science, and the science gives an official stamp of science to the Bible. Okay, the Bible becomes scientific, and the geography book becomes sacred. So this is what you have. And thou shalt spread across the west, the east, the north, and south. And they translate it for the children. The interpretation of the phrase, in future your country will expand to the west, to the east, and so on and so forth. And then you have all kinds of phrases that tell Abraham that you'll have the country from Iraq to Saudi and so on and so forth from the Bible. It's all from the Bible. Achilles Mbembe, who is a philosopher, he has a book named Necropolitics, and he says that about Israel. It's very interesting. The Israeli narrative is underpinned by the idea that the state has divine right to exist. Violence and sovereignty in this case claim a divine foundation. History, geography, cartography, archaeology are supposed to back these claims, and this is what happens in Israel, really. Ilan Pappes says always that most Israelis don't believe in God, but they believe God gave them the land. Okay? And this is it. Because it's not a religious book. It's state book. One of, again, very interesting thing is what we call mental maps. Mental maps are very important. As you see here, I'll show you an example of mental map here. Arab villages are factors that inhibit the development of the Arab village. Why are they so underdeveloped? Because they are far from the center. The roads to them are difficult, and they have remained out of the process of change and development. They are hardly exposed to modern life, and there are difficulties to connect them to the electricity and water system, networks. Where are these villages? I mean, we're not talking Australia here, okay? Where are these villages that are so far away? Now, this is an interesting map that was issued by the Foreign Ministry called the Narrow Waistline of Israel. It was a Bibi idea to show the world how small we are and threatened. So they show you here that Israel at its widest is 50 kilometers, no more. So all these Arab villages, you know, that are so far from development are here somewhere. Okay? But, of course, nobody knows that and nobody cares. It's a mental map so Palestinians are never depicted at all as human beings. When they are depicted as the problems they constitute for Israel. The refugees problem, Asiatic backwardness, demographic problem, and security threat. For example, in the Jewish sector, there is no objection to allocate some of the private lands for public building. In the Arab sector, there is an expectation that all public services and needs will be provided from the state reservoir of lands. They are unwilling to give anything for the general good. Okay? So this is a homogeneous, it's in their blood. This is the point of racism. It's in their blood. Okay? Nothing you can do about it. Jews are whatever. Arabs are whatever. Yeah. The Palestinian Authority steals water from Israel in Ramallah. The Arab society is traditional and object to changes by its nature. Reluctant to adopt novelties, modernization seems dangerous to them. Okay? Now, what do we see? This. This icon, which is a racist icon, it was defined as a racist icon. There's an encyclopedia of racist icons. Shows you a person which is an imaginary Alibaba of some European painter or something, but every time they speak about Arab citizens, this is what they see. Okay, this is what they see. This creature. He has a wife and children and other things, yeah? Everybody the same, but this is what you see. And under the picture, they say the Arabs refuse to live in high buildings and insist on living in land-ridden one-story houses. Other representations is, of course, the primitive farmer, all right? The primitive farmer. And the last thing I want to speak about, how do the books in Israel legitimate massacres? How they legitimate killing? We saw yesterday in the movie, you know. We were so moral, we were so cautious, but every doll was mined. Every doll, every bed, every pregnant woman has a bomb inside, and so on. This is the kind of things that we hear. Let's see what they say in the book. First of all, Palestinians are dehumanized. When you know that Israeli journalists are not allowed to call Palestinians victims, ever. They can be corpses, cadavers, whatever, but not victims, never. So also in the school books, they are neutralized. They are objects. Between 100 and 240 corpses were found, more than 40 were killed, a few dozens were killed, like you speak of animals. This is one thing. But this is not the main thing. Now, there are really rhetorical ways of legitimating the massacres, because you speak, for example, in this study I told you, they say, look how brave we are. We even speak of the massacres, okay? We don't deny them. And this is true because there are some massacres that are still debated, Dir Yassin, Kfar Qassem, and so on, okay? Most massacres are okay because they were made according to plan, but these were not in 48. So something which is called mythopoiesis. What does it mean? It's like in mythology. Oedipus killed his father, but he saved the city. Okay? So saving the city becomes a good reason to kill the father. All right? Until he's punished. Dir Yassin. All the books present it like the slaughter of a friendly Palestinians in a village brought about the flight of other Palestinians, which enabled the establishment of a coherent Jewish state. And as I said before, this is the highest principle. No, you don't have to explain anything. This is the highest goal. Because of Dir Yassin, there was a massive flight of Palestinians, and that enabled us to create a coherent Jewish state with Jewish majority. All right? So that was... They don't say that the massacre was good. They don't say that at all. But they say that the far-reaching consequences, okay, were good. It's not the same thing. Effect-oriented legitimation. This is like Oedipus. You look at the result, and from there, you suppose this was the reason. Okay, but it was not. Of course, you cannot give reasons to massacres. You cannot. Okay, because massacres are bad. But you go, and like from hindsight, you say that maybe somebody thought about it. Beginning with the fact that the massacre had happened, and you see its effect, you legitimate it, and you see what were the conditions that enabled it or allowed it. But you also see it a posteriori. For example, Kibbia massacre. Slaughter of innocent Palestinians in their homes in Kibbia brought about some confidence to Jews in their homes. All the books said that. Okay? And restored the morale and dignity to the army and helped it become a deterrent, vigorous army whose long arm can reach the enemy deep in their own territory. So by the time you finish the chapter, you forget that they killed innocent people. Okay? And you remember the good consequences for the army and for the citizens. And again, I go to Mbembe because he's one of the few people who write about racism and mention Israel. Most people who write about racism in the world, in Europe, in America, they don't mention Israel. Not at all. But he does. And he says, one's horror at the sight of death turned into satisfaction. Okay? Why did it bring confidence? Because you're satisfied that he died and not you. Okay? Each enemy killed makes the survivor feel more secure. Okay? He doesn't know Israeli school books, but he knows this. So this is the philosophy. For example, after Dir Yassin Massacre, one book says, in the month after that, the Jewish community was privileged with many military success. Now, the choice of word, privileged, means Okay, it was the best. Or its most crucial effect was in the short run. Although it did not inaugurate the massive escape of Israel's Arabs, which had started before, it had nevertheless accelerated it. Now, inauguration is a very festive word, right? When we make inauguration, it's something very happy. And again, you don't have to explain it because it is inculcated from early age that this was our miracle. And of course, what they say, the escape of the Arabs following the Dir Yassin Massacre solved a terrifying demographic problem. And even a moderate person such as the first president, Weizmann, spoke about it as a miracle. Okay, so he didn't say you had to kill them, but he said the fact that they fled is a miracle for us. Okay, so at the beginning of the chapter you say, oh my God, terrible thing, massacre. Yes? And they legitimate the massacre. But by the end of the chapter, you come out with this. And we see it everywhere in Israel, in Gaza, and so on. And there's something that we call moral abstraction. You take the action as you make it moral by abstracting it from the context. The massacre of Kibbia is moralized by being defined as Israeli reaction to Arab hostility. Okay, and that's it. Or somebody even say a proper response. And then you have questions. What was the expression of Arab hostility? Do you think Israel's reaction was effective and justified? So the children are trained to justify it. These are more questions. 50 Egyptians were killed. 40 were taken prisoner. The greatest operation since the War of Independence. In what way can such a headline influence the morale of Israeli citizens? Okay? And why did Israel choose the way of reprisals, though it involved the killing of innocent people? And this is very important. Nobody wants to kill innocent people, and every Israeli will tell you that. Every soldier will tell you that. Our hand is stretched for peace. But they make it impossible for us not to kill them, okay? And this is it. Although it involved the killing of innocent people, this is not the main thing. This is not the main thing. This is a side effect. Unnecessary, we don't like it, but this is not the main thing. Do you think the reprisals were enough to deter the Arabs from acting against Israel? And this, of course, goes with all kinds of biblical things. Kibbia was a punitive action, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go on. Kafar Qasim is very interesting because all the books speak less about the massacre and more about the trial. I don't know if you know, but after the Kafar Qasim massacre, there was a trial, and the judge used terms that were used in Nuremberg against the Nazis. He compared the soldiers to the Nazis. He said, and this was 53, he said they obeyed a manifestly unlawful order. And this is what was said about the Nazis. So when the last massacre of Gaza occurred, not the last one, 2009, the Minister of Education said all schools should learn this trial in order for the children to be sure that we are moral. And when our soldiers do something bad, we take them to trial, and they are not allowed to obey manifestly unlawful order, and so on and so forth. Okay? So they teach this trial as an achievement of Israeli justice. Of course, they don't tell you that they never spent any time in jail. They were sentenced to 17 years, but nobody spent more than 3 months. This is not in the books, but the trial is in the books, okay? And then every time, one of the most interesting things is explanation. How do you explain massacre? Because now what we saw is the legitimation, but this is not the explanations. Why did they die? Why did they have to die? They didn't do anything. So they give explanation again that we hear today. In Dir Yassin, the loudspeaker encouraging the inhabitants of Dir Yassin to leave the village did not work. What can we do? That's why they died. And in Kibbia, the soldiers did not know the people were hiding in their homes that night. Strange, huh? This is the kind of explanations you get. And then always, after speaking about the massacre and everything, there is a praising of the killers. Okay, the praising of the killers, even the glorification and mythization of the killers. For example, the soldiers were endowed with extraordinary courage, improvisation, perseverance, Okay, so such wonderful people could not have done an unjustified wrong. Yes, they did something wrong, but they had their reasons. And you have a poem or you have iconic photograph. For example, here you have Ariel Sharon and all his murderers. And this is a poster saying that growth against siege. You see, Jews are coming to Israel, and here is the lurking Arab waiting for them, and this is the answer. All right, and here they praise them, and here is the massacre. So by the time you come here, and you've seen this picture, and you know who these people are, you are convinced that even if they had done wrong, they had a good reason. What is the overall claim? Positive outcome for us may condone or overlook evil done to them. Or so much pain inflicted of them is intolerable if it prevents a much greater pain for us. So Israeli school books command the students to forget the other drama, that of the victims, because we never had testimony of the victims and their circumstances, and look ahead of massacres and other catastrophes to the favorable consequences for the Jews, for the nation. They teach the students the discourse of power of politician and of general, but put at stake the disciplinary politics of truth, because this is not how historians write. Okay, so as I told you before, the facts are not the most important thing, and they produce what is called elite racism. It's racism that comes from above. These people are problems, these people are threats, these people are not people, really. So we can do what we have to do. Okay, so I'll finish here. This is the last one, but we talked about it. And I hope you got some kind of picture about Israeli education. And this is mainstream education. It's not religious education. It's not anything else. It's mainstream schools. Okay? Secular mainstream schools, which make most of the army, of the soldiers.